Jesus tries to ride into Jerusalem as a humble man of the people. He selects a donkey to carry him in rather than a war horse. His animal would have been smaller in stature and not as valuable as a horse might have been. And the donkey enters the town without a shining coat and rippled muscles, carrying a man who never sought the position of earthly king. Symbols like this, like the donkey, would have been especially important in the ancient world. In an agrarian society like the ancient Near East, only 2 to 4% of the people were literate. Stories about who Jesus is and who he claims to be, the healing miracles, and his teachings would have been passed by word of mouth. The symbolism of Jesus choosing to ride a donkey rather than a horse would speak to the gathered crowds of who Jesus himself claims to be. Not a man threatening Herod's power or seeking to displace the Roman government, but a man who is at the level of the people on this smaller animal rather than towering over them on a grand horse. For some, this might be their first glance at this man that has caused rumors and stories to swirl through town. Maybe some have come from the poor, outlying areas into the city to catch a glimpse of this Jesus who walks among the people, eats with prostitutes and sinners, and who is willing to touch the lepers. In spite of Jesus' efforts to enter Jerusalem as a humble servant rather than a king, the people don't fully get the message. They welcome him like a king, throwing their cloaks on the ground so that the dust of the street will not rise up around Jesus, clinging to his clothes and sticking to his skin. They shout, "Hosanna, save us!" But I wonder, are they shouting for Jesus to save them as God might save? Or are they shouting for Jesus to save them as an earthly king might? The crowds are known for being fickle. When Jesus is arrested later in the story, the crowds are given the chance to set him free. And just a week after this parade into Jerusalem, instead of shouting, "Hosanna," they turn their shouts to crucify him and hand him over for death. Perhaps this cry of "crucify him" comes from the same place that causes us to want to jump from the parade, which we normally celebrate the Sunday before Easter, straight to the resurrection of Easter without wading into the deep and difficult waters of Holy Week. "Save us," they shout. "Save us from the Roman captors, the oppression of the religious elite, from poverty, from suffering, from being trampled on by the circumstances of life." Instead, Jesus allows himself to be arrested. How can a criminal save them from anything? He has betrayed them, masquerading as a king, only to give way to the power of the Romans. No wonder they shout, "Crucify him." He's not who they thought he was. But perhaps if they had remembered the donkey instead of the war horse, they might have realized that Jesus himself never claimed that he would save them from the military powers of the day. Instead, he will save them, he will save us by calling them to be humble, to cultivate compassion for the suffering of others, to extend love and grace instead of violence and hate. On Ash Wednesday, Pastor Alexa and I went to Sylvester Park to impose ashes on any who might want them. Ashes to go, this practice is often called. I know, right? During the pandemic, sometimes it was done as a drive-through ashes. I understand that in other parts of the country, this is a popular practice. People will stand in line at subway stations to receive ashes from strangers. This is not the case in Washington. I have done this public imposition of ashes in various ways since my first year as a church planter some 7 years ago. The first year, I was also in Sylvester Park with Pastor Ruth and Pastor Meredith, 2 of the pastors from Co-op. Pastor Ruth was from here, for those of you who were around then. We were met mostly with skepticism. A few people agreed to ashes or a prayer. One or two told us their story. One woman, I still remember from 7 years ago, told us about her estrangement from her daughter and her grief at the recent loss of her sister. She talked about how alone she felt and asked us to hold her in prayer. In the subsequent years, I have stood outside in freezing rain, had my nose turned bright red with cold, and spilled oily ashes on my one dress with a clergy collar that I no longer wear because it has oil and ashes on it. One year, a middle school peer of my daughter later asked her if her mom was in a cult because she saw me standing outside of the Island Market grocery store in Steamboat Island with an ashen cross on my forehead and my clergy collar on. True story. Let me just tell you how much my daughter, as a middle schooler, loved it when one of her peers was like, "Is your mom in a cult?" That went over real well. This year, Pastor Alexa and I placed ashes on people with obvious mental illness. Most were houseless. Some stayed and talked to us. Others took only the hot coffee we offered. And one man mistook us for prostitutes rather than pastors, even though I had marked his hand with an ashen cross and prayed with him. You cannot make this stuff up. I would much rather gather here in the warm sanctuary with you and wave the palms or ferns and shout with joy to remember the parade into Jerusalem. Palm Sunday always has a bit of a party feel to it for me. If Jesus were entering Jerusalem now, I think it might look like the players coming onto the field for the Super Bowl with colored confetti and smoke and fireworks echoing in the sky. As I wrote those words earlier this week, I Googled Super Bowl parade so I could see images to spark my imagination as I wrote this sermon. What came up on my Google search was a shooting that took place in Kansas City just a half hour before I Googled. Like the crowds of Palm Sunday, I long for something that doesn't exist this side of heaven. For Jesus to save us from the military powers, from our own love of violence, from ourselves by swooping in and just making everything okay. I long for that earthly king to ride in on a war horse, and when I shout Hosanna, for him to make it all okay. But that is not the way of the donkey, or the way of the cross, nor is it the path that leads to resurrection. Even on that Palm Sunday, at that joyful parade where the people mistook Jesus for an earthly king, the shadow of the cross was already lurking, as those same people would turn on a dime and call for Jesus to die. So too, as I sat and wrote a sermon and longed for something as big and spectacular as a Super Bowl parade, the evil powers of this world were at work, turning joy into something that we had to grieve, and turning what could have been just a sunny and joyful day into an event marked with tears. Our salvation doesn't come from Jesus' earthly power. Our salvation comes from walking with the one who turned the world upside down by giving away power, by riding on a donkey, and by loving us all the way to the cross. It comes to us, the salvation that God offers, when we place ashes on the most vulnerable in our society, touching their unwashed skin without flinching. It comes in offering a warm cup of coffee on a cold morning to people who will never place $1 in our offering plate or show up to worship with us. It comes when we lay down our weapons and our words and call upon Jesus when we lay down our weapons and our words that call upon Jesus to ride in on a victorious war horse, and instead ask Jesus to show us the way of the donkey. This season of Lent, let us picture ourselves in this story. Let us be honest about who we are. I know that I am tempted to be in the crowds on Palm Sunday, laying down a cloak, pushing Jesus to be the earthly king I want him to be. I would be there probably throwing confetti and shouting, Hosanna, and misunderstanding everything the whole time. But let us also surrender ourselves, not to the story we want to tell, but to the one that Jesus tells, to the one that is true and has the power to bring us to life. I will leave you with these words from Henry Nouwen, mystic, scholar, humble servant, about the season of Lent. He says, "It is a time to be with you, Jesus, in a special way, a time to pray, to fast, and thus to follow you on your way to Jerusalem, to Golgotha, and to the final victory over death. I am still so divided. I truly want to follow you, but I also want to follow my own desires and lend an ear to the voices that speak about prestige and success and human respect and pleasure and power and influence. Help me to become deaf to those voices and more attentive to your voice, which calls me to choose the narrow road to life." And so, friends, let us seek this Lent, the narrow road that leads to life, the road that the donkey chose, the road that Jesus chose. May we find our salvation there, and in finding our salvation, may we be a part of the resurrection that God has for the world. Amen.